All right, I just started recording, just so everybody knows. We're now live and going on YouTube. Today we are lecturing about stress or the endocrinology and neural basis of stress. And we will next week have a or next class have a pure discussion-based class. And I would like you to go ahead and work on those thought paragraphs to get those submitted before the lecture. Somebody is giving us a little bit of background noise. If you could look into that. But in addition, this lecture on stress or the PowerPoint will go on one more lecture after that. And everybody should have their Sapolsky book. Zebras, why zebras don't get ulcers, and hopefully we will be read up for a good discussion on that starting on Wednesday. Especially if you go ahead and work on those uh, thought paragraphs. So let's just go ahead and get into the lecture here. And did anybody have any issues with the test that we just took? Issues with the quiz? I'll get those graded soon. All right. Huh. All right. So, here I'm just going to start with a little analogy of my coffee mug. So, the absolute weight of the actual coffee mug doesn't really matter when you think about how heavy this is. It really depends on how long I hold it. So, for example, if I hold it for a minute, it's not going to be much of a problem. If I hold it for an hour, I'll have an ache in my arm. If I hold it for a day, my arm will feel numb and paralyzed. In each case, the weight of the glass doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the heavier it becomes. The stresses and worries in life are like a glass of water. Think about them for a while and nothing happens. But think about them a bit longer and they begin to hurt. And if you think about them all day, you will begin to feel paralyzed, incapable of doing anything. So remember to put the glass down. Just sort of a general introduction to this idea of stress and how to deal with it. And we're going to learn that the neurobiology of short-term versus long-term stress or chronic stress are quite different. So another thing I'd like you to think about is in 1900, what do you think were the leading causes of death? Anybody? How did people
Disease.
disease? Absolutely, various diseases and diseases that were a little different than what we think of now. And influenza, the flu, tuberculosis, pneumonia. These were the things that people died of in old age, which really wasn't that old. It was very common to, have a sort of a sense of mortality, which really, it's sort of odd that our generation, your generation, my generation, or some of the first generations that, do not think of death as something that's going to happen, at like in the short term. We think that there will be, a large, long life and possibly even retirement. In addition, if you were a young woman, one of the most riskiest things you could do was try to give birth. Women don't die of childbirth so much anymore, in part because of advances in hospitals and the medical system. But as I said, I mean, tuberculosis or TB, pneumonia, and influenza killed the majority of older people. And by that, I mean like 50 years old, 40 years old. People did not, so people really died of what you think of as traditional, sort of like pandemic like diseases. Today, however, few people under the age of 100 die of the flu or influenza, and very few women die of childbirth. Instead, we die of utterly bizarre diseases that have never existed before on the planet in any sort of numbers whatsoever. Diseases like heart disease, cancer, adult onset or type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. These things did not exist in great number many years ago because people simply didn't live long enough to get them. And there's certainly different ways of dying. And one thing that all of those latter category has, like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative diseases in general, is that they can all be exacerbated or brought on by stress. These were really issues that nobody ever had to think about before. It's somewhat like a bizarre question. What's your psychological makeup? What's your social status? Or how do people with your social status get treated in your society? I mean, these are new questions that, really people just didn't have time to think about, when life was shorter and, technology wasn't sort of helping us and supplementing the way that we live. And here's another big one. Why is it that when we're feeling unloved, we eat more starch or we eat more carbs? I get the same way when I'm tired. Why is it that when I'm tired, I eat more pasta or stressed out? I have my comfort foods. Like, yeah, I certainly have my favorite comfort foods. Pasticcio from the Greek restaurants, mini dishes from the Indian restaurants, and don't even get me started on Italian food. So indeed, when you look at diseases or what the diseases that do us in now, they're predominantly diseases that can be caused or exacerbated by stress. As a result, most of us in this online forum will have the profound westernized luxury of dropping dead someday of a stress related disease. And that's why it's so urgent that we understand stress and really how to better manage stress. So, another important concept to keep in mind when we're thinking about stress and what effect it's really having is homeostasis. Homeostasis is having an ideal body temperature, an ideal level of glucose in the bloodstream, and really basically an ideal everything. That is being in homeostatic balance. And recall that the endocrine system tends to have tightly controlled levels of transmission. So if these things are out of balance, either too much or too little, your homeostasis can be challenged, and basically your systems throughout your body can be disrupted in a negative way that can influence health. So if a stressor can knock us away from homeostasis, what is a stressor? Well, it's something that's really hard to define, and we're not really going like you can attack the definition of stress very easily. But for here, we're going to define a stressor as anything in the outside world that knocks you out of this homeostatic balance. So when a stressor appears in your life, you need to ideally reestablish your balance. To do that, you initially secrete epinephrine, norepinephrine, and other hormones. And epinephrine and norepinephrine are synonymous with adrenaline and noradrenaline. You'll probably find me using these terms interchangeably. I really hope not to confuse you. But epinephrine is the same as adrenaline, and norepinephrine is the same as noradrenaline. When this happens, you mobilize energy and you deliver it where is needed. When you do that, which would be more associated with a sympathetic response, your parasympathetic functions shut off. You don't need inessentials like your sex drive and digestion during these periods of stress, essentially what you evolved to survive the lion attack. You enhance immune defenses and you think more clearly when you can devote your energy to sort of select, outcomes and functions. So when you're facing a short-term physical crisis, and the stress response is what you do with your body, how you devote your energy. And keep in mind that there are energy limits in what you can do. And think about, keep in mind that your brain uses 20% of your energy normally as well. Like when you are thinking on a regular basis, for example. I mean, that's just going to take 20% of your daily energy right there. So, uh, when you are established or experiencing a stressful event, I mean, like it can also be difficult to concentrate. Your cognitive capacity can be affected, in addition to your sex drive, digestion, so many other functions throughout the body that would be sort of shut down in to increase or deal with your stress response, which again was evolved or selected for to deal with things like a lion attack. But in modern society, how are these really helpful? So one thing that I want to get into here is I want to show you a little video clip of Sapolsky presenting an interesting take and sales pitch on this sort of phenomenon. He is an incredibly dynamic speaker and writer. So, hopefully this also hypes you up a little bit to delve into our book and discussion in our next class. Hopefully this plays.
How do erections work? Oh, thank God, something finally useful in this lecture. How do erections, I just saw somebody pick up a pen for the first time this whole lecture. Okay, so how do erections work? In order to appreciate that, we go back to exactly the nervous system component that Docker was talking about before: the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic, sympathetic, emergency, arousal, all hell breaking loose, adrenaline, stress response, parasympathetic, calm, vegetative function, big starchy meal, take a nap, working in opposition. Okay, here's the rule. In order to get an erection, you've got to turn on the parasympathetic nervous system. You've got to be calm and vegetative. Okay, so you got your erection. What happens next? Maybe something to do with the social context that brought about the erection in the first place. Maybe you start feeling a little bit less calm and vegetative. Maybe you start breathing a little bit faster. Maybe your heart rate increases. Maybe you're beginning to expend some muscular energy. Maybe you're beginning to turn on the sympathetic nervous system. And more time goes by and you're breathing faster and your heart's racing. And eventually, your toes are curling and you're sweating and all of that. And you're like turning on the sympathetic nervous system throughout the whole body, except for this one lone outpost where you're desperately holding on to parasympathetic tone as long as possible. Finally, you can't take it anymore. You turn off the parasympathetic, you turn on the sympathetic, and you ejaculate. Okay, so that's how erections work. That's how erections work. And the question becomes, what happens during stress? What happens during stress? You're not very calm and vegetative. You have trouble having an erection in the first place because you can't establish that parasympathetic tone. Or you can have a second problem. Suppose you do indeed manage to get an erection there, but you think, oh my God, global warming, something or other. You accelerate the transition from parasympathetic to sympathetic, and the whole thing goes too quickly. Incredibly easy for this sort of erectile dysfunction to occur. Current estimates are 60% of the doctor's visits in this country by men with erectile dysfunction. It turns out it is not organic in basis, it is stress related.
So, as you can see, Sapolsky is an animated, guy that I think is an excellent presenter and just a natural storyteller. And hopefully that gets you a little excited about the discussion we're going to have on Wednesday. He also brought up an important point that really the sympathetic and parasympathetic really have to work together for the entire sort of male sexual response. You know, that we I think there might be a tendency to think of the parasympathetic and sympathetic competing against one another, and in many cases they do. So, when during a stressful recovery, the parasympathetic might get turned on, where we are basically in wound recovery mode, and there, we might be driven to eat the starchy meal and so on and so forth. But in the sympathetic, we might turn off parts of the parasympathetic to devote more attention to dilation of blood vessels, everything that we need to basically fight or flee. And but there are instances that the two work together. So I mean, if you're in extreme sympathetic drive mode, in an extremely stressful situation, like, I don't know, a 15-year-old boy being approached by an incredibly out of your league girl, you might have issues with the parasympathetic response that actually leads to the erection. But the sympathetic is actually what's responsible for ejaculation. So the two have to work together in concert. I like to say in behavioral neuro, where I teach that, the dynamics between parasympathetic and sympathetic in greater detail, that the parasympathetic aims and the sympathetic shoots. But anyway, so that this isn't really why stress of what I mean. It's also important to think about, like, why stress evolved the way that it has, and how it sort of gets in the way of function in our modern society, where we don't really have to worry about the lion attacks and these sorts of things. We humans turn on the stress response now more with memories associated with emotions and thoughts, not so much when we see a lion in the wild, because, well, we rarely do unless you live in the mountains, where I guess we do have mountain lions, but it's also true that the mountain lions rarely attack humans. So even if you did see one, you're probably going to be okay. But anyway, and one issue here, though, is that if these things are triggering our stress, and in sort of modern society where we're living longer and we're starting to think about things like, how am I going to afford to retire? What happens if Social Security goes away? Oh my God, look at our government. If you do this regularly enough, you're going to damage your cardiovascular system. Increased blood flow hammers on the walls of your blood vessels, causing inflammation. Fat, glucose, and cholesterol will glom on and begin to clog your arteries, especially if you're eating bad foods, in part due to the stress response, because you're in this incredible cycle of freak out, recover, freak out, recover, freak out, recover. Some ways it's like our thoughts lead us to this sort of perpetual lion attack, where in reality, we're not being attacked by a lion, but our system evolved to help us survive from that situation. And now it's pretty hard to chill out, because what we're seeing around us and flashed on the news, and I mean, some of these things are happening in reality. That drives our lion attack response, and it can actually be detrimental to our health. You're going to be at more risk for chronic fatigue, sleep disruption, muscle atrophy, and adult onset diabetes, all things that we see, in our society. And it's crazy, especially if you travel a lot internationally. We in America are particularly bad at this. It's probably affecting our, life expectancy. To be such a wealthy nation, our life expectancy is much lower than it should be. Uh, you know, Obesity outside of Colorado is basically the only state in the country where obesity is not on an incredible increase in frequency. But if you compare it internationally, you're going to find very few countries that can compare to our obesity rates. From my experience, it's sort of interesting moving from the Carolinas and Maryland, where obesity is very common, especially in the Carolinas, to Colorado. It's a very different life perspective. There is greater focus on health in Colorado than many other states. And also, it's also worth noting that life expectancy is higher in Colorado. But anyway, it can still be better, most certainly. And in some ways, our society really, just says, bring on stress, essentially. And, it's just part of the competitive nature that we have. And, it does lead to great things. I think the competition that is inherent in our society, it's very necessary to see greatness come out, see your Elon Musk type people rise above in very small numbers. But overall, it's also important to note that there is incredible stress, and we need to find ways to cope with that stress, which isn't something that's really taught well. And of course, we're focusing here more on the endocrinology, but I do hope to take a little bit of time at some point to consider negative and healthy coping strategies. Probably you've heard more from our clinical faculty, and maybe you guys can tell me and teach me how to deal with stress better. But chronic stress is bad. I mean, not only does it do bad things to the nervous system, it kills neurons in the part of the brain called the hippocampus, which impairs the formation and retrieval of long-term memories. And essentially, in very simple terms, it feeds the amygdala. You can actually see and observe anatomically the amygdala increase in size in people that have been exposed to chronic stress. Chronic stress basically creates a hyperreactive and hysterical amygdala. And this tells us tons about what stress has to do with anxiety disorders. Stress also affects the mesolimbic dopamine system, which typically helps process rewarding, reinforcing, pleasurable things. Cocaine also works on the dopamine system, as do all euphoriants or euphoriants. Chronic stress causes these pathways to get depleted of dopamine, which basically takes away your ability to feel pleasure. So if stress depletes your dopamine, what have you really set yourself up for? Well, that would be major depression. And, it's also worth noting that, there are antidepressants out there. There's probably not one antidepressant that works well for everybody. But Wellbutrin or bupropion, is one antidepressant that is essentially a dopamine uptake inhibitor, similar to cocaine, but it's just very long lasting, and a noradrenaline uptake inhibitor. It doesn't actually touch serotonin at all. And if you wanted to read a little bit more on the role of dopamine in depression, Eric Nestler has several very good reviews detailing this idea. And one final thing that I'll say about that I touch on a lot in my drugs class is that it's very likely that through the 70s and, in particular, through the 60s and 70s, I contend, as have others, that I think a lot of people were using amphetamines in high numbers prescribed by the doctors to treat lethargy and depression. I'm not recommending that necessarily. Using amphetamine or methamphetamine to deal with depression can actually cause a lot of additional problems. But I'm just using that as a way of saying that, the dopaminergic system also, is something that has been a target, I believe, historically, to treat depression, and it somewhat makes sense, in my opinion. And read Eric Nestler for greater in-depth ideas on that. So how do you cope with stress? Really, some of us do a very good job of coping. However, and there's a subset that is spectacular at coping. So really from day one, stress researchers have wondered why some bodies and some psyches deal better with stress than others. In making sense of individual differences, what we're essentially asking is what is it that makes psychological stress stressful? And a huge, elegant literature by now has shown precisely what the building blocks are. Here's a little bit on. So, first, I want to tell you that it's also very easy to attack the concept of the type A personality. I'm not saying that there is definitely this very clear personality type called type A. All I'm saying is that it describes some interesting characteristics that are related to stress. And now I'm going to let Sapolsky, speak on this again to get you guys a little pumped up for Wednesday, but also, he says it quite eloquently. I didn't get this.
Meyer here in San Francisco, cardiologists Meyer, Friedman, and Rosenman, and here was
right. And while I get the timing right here, I also wanted to point out that he's also going to tell you a little bit about the discovery of the concept of the type A personality, which is fascinating, is done in Framingham, Massachusetts. And interestingly, I think an upholsterer deserves a lot of the credit here. Let's just listen to Sapolsky tell the story.
Here in San Francisco, cardiologists Meyer, Friedman, and Rosenman, and here was their original formulation. Time pressured, hostile, impatient, low self-esteem, joyless striving. Okay, like 80% of us. And what these guys reported was, if this is what you're like, you are more at risk for heart disease. Cardiologists hated these guys. You're some 1950s Ozzie and Harriet cardiologist, and all you're thinking about is heart valves. And here's these guys instead saying, no, you got to sit down your patient and talk with Christ. Who wants to talk to their patients and say, okay, so you're in the supermarket and you've picked the line that's going the slowest. You go out of your mind. That has something to do with heart disease. Huge resistance in the field. And it took decades to become absolutely clear from all the meta-analyses. Type A is for real, big time. If you have a type A profile, you are more at risk than if you smoke, than if you have elevated cholesterol levels, than if you are overweight. In terms of heart disease, it's a huge risk factor. And one of the things that's emerged in this field in recent years is a recognition of one of the key components of the type A profile, something that is now referred to as toxic hostility. And this is this attributional style where anything that happens in the world around you is proof that they're out to get you preferentially, and the only way to protect yourself is have the knives out 24/7. This is, you pick the wrong line in the supermarket and you want to kill the son of a bitch, get behind the cash register, come on, I have a 1 o'clock appointment. No, don't ask her how she is today, come on. If this is what you're doing, instead of checking out the Elvis sightings in the National Enquirer, your blood pressure is going to go up. And if this is what you're doing every time somebody could have held the elevator door open for you but didn't, you are going to cumulatively damage this system. And in lots of ways, the central question in this field now is, insofar as you have this toxic hostility, what's worse for your heart, expressing the hostility or keeping it repressed inside? What's clear is expressing it is worse for everybody else's blood vessels there, but what is the cost of repressing strong physiological sort of emotions? Okay, so that's stress and heart disease. Actually, one might wonder, how is it that these guys ever figured out about type A personality? How did they discover this? And I got to hear this story some years ago from the horse's mouth himself. Meyer Friedman, cardiology, first described it. Died a few years ago in his 90s and was seeing patients up until the end. And as he used to say, I'm still type A, but I'm a type A tortoise now. And here was the story he would tell about the discovery of type A personality. Okay, 1950s, he and his partner had this cardiology practice, San Francisco. Everything was fine. There was this one weird problem they were having, which was they were spending a fortune having to reupholster the armchairs in the waiting room. What is this about? Who knows? It's just part of the overhead. Every month, the upholsterer comes in, a chair or two to fix. 1 month, the upholsterer is on vacation. Replacement upholsterer comes in, takes one look at the chairs, and discovers type A personality. Says, what is wrong with your patients? Nobody wears out chairs this way. And this is what it looked like. What you see is the front 2 inches of the seat, the front 2 inches of the armrest are torn to shreds like beavers are in there, dwarf beavers all night going on there. What is this? This is what a type A individual looks like when they are not just figuratively, but literally clawing at the arms of their chair there. This is them squishing and moving around. This is what an individual with a type A profile looks like when they're sitting in their cardiologist's office waiting for getting a result. This is exactly what it looks like. Okay, so what's supposed to happen at that point if science is working correctly? Like Friedman should grab him, like, good God, man, what you've discovered, or like midnight conferences between upholsterers and cardiologists, or teams of idealistic young upholsterers sweeping across America and coming back with the news that no, you don't find chairs like these in podiatrists' offices. That's what should have happened. What actually happens, here's where Dr. Friedman starts looking all sheepish. He says, I told my nurse, get this man out of my face. I'm this important doctor. He's wasting my time. Give him his damn check. He was too type A to listen to the guy. And it was years before he collaborated with a psychologist, and out popped this profile. And he said, oh my God, the upholsterer was right. To this day, nobody knows who that guy was. Let's see, it's early afternoon. I am willing to bet there in some bar in the marina or something right now, there's some 95-year-old retired upholsterer who's just drinking away there. And you get him started, and he's going to go on and on about how he discovered type A personality. Absolutely true. So one of those dark moments in the history of science.
So yeah, hopefully you found that to be interesting. You know, he is again a very how do we move forward? Okay, stop. There we go. So you know, from that, and in addition to the Framingham cardiac study, which was conducted in Framingham, Massachusetts, and is you know, it has tracked sort of long-term changes in cardiovascular health associated with multi-generations of people. We now know that you know, a variety of things can affect, you know, cardiac health and heart attack, including you know, being a type A personality. And you know, I think other members of the psych department might jump on me for this, but I am a admitted type A personality, and it is something that I am going to have to I need to do better with. I haven't quite become a tortoise yet, but I hopefully will go in that direction so I do not end up in one of these graphs here. But the Framingham Health cardiac study has demonstrated that you know, a wide array of factors can influence cardiac health, including stress level, emotions, and you know, your diet, amongst many other things. But emotional stress, I think, is you know, something else that I want to touch on here, and it can be blamed for regional increases in cardiovascular death following high-profile events. So one example here involves the Super Bowl, and which is especially timely and relevant, seeing how it just happened last night. But there have been studies that have demonstrated, and this is just a graph from your own textbook, that shows that you know, if you live in the city where a Super Bowl team lost, you are going to see an increase in cardiac deaths. Whereas if you're in the team where the Super Bowl team just won, you will see an increase in, or a decrease in, the amount of cardiac deaths. This year, we might have an interesting additional factor here, where you would see the Patriots fans here in an additional graph. I would be interested to see if more people died of heart attacks in New England with the loss of Gronkowski and Brady, or did they die in Kansas City? I honestly don't know what I would predict there. Either way, it would be a grim prediction, but a true phenomenon. And again, think of the evolutionary basis here. A team, whether it be a soccer team, and I think that these relationships are even more pronounced when you think of the global elite soccer teams. But those, and in America, our football teams have sort of taken on the identity of our group. And going back to how societies interacted, there used to be warring little nation states, and essentially we are sort of wired to crave this, to crave that we have this sort of identity of warriors that are going out and defending, or the honor of our city state. And right, that if our team were to lose, that's going to bode very poorly for us. So I really do feel that there is even an evolutionary basis to this. And it's really not even in humans. Chimpanzees in particular are known to have territorial wars, very bloody affairs, really. But even ants have territorial wars. I think that this is a highly ingrained biological phenomenon. So life is tough, right? We all have stress. There's this incredible pressure to survive and arguably to reproduce. That people talk about the biological clock kicking in and sort of jolting you to want to reproduce all of a sudden. And overpopulation and this concept of being a breeder and all this sort of thrown out of the window. There is, I would say, a clear evolutionary biological drive to basically reproduce. And this is something that I think people start stressing on relatively young. My elementary school children, are already thinking about these concepts of marriage, mate selection, reproduction. These, again, I think are ingrained concepts. And of course, the pressure to survive and hopefully have money to retire and be able to live in old age. Not to mention in our society, you might need a good job. You might need to be bona fide to attract that mate. These are things that can produce an incredible amount of stress and perpetual stress, especially when you're in college and you are working toward becoming bona fide. These are very difficult things that can have chronic effects on one's health if you do not learn ways to cope in a healthy manner. And again, we vary quite a bit on these. I for one have a history of basically type A type personality responses and behaviors, and negative coping strategies. In college, in graduate school, I remember especially thinking that I could go out and have a few beers. The world's oldest and first anxiolytic, calm down. Go eat a big pizza. Go to the hot dog cart outside the pub after they close down. These sorts of things. These are very negative coping strategies, though, that don't really help long term. Alternatively, there are long term healthy coping strategies. And what I would like to do now is to break up the monotony here and put you guys in breakout rooms for about 5 minutes so you can discuss negative and healthy coping strategies, things that have worked well for you, possibly behaviors that you want to get away from, that are really negative coping strategies and are going to produce more harm over time, such as binge eating, drinking alcohol, using other drugs to overcome one's stressors. Things like exercise, yoga, uh, reading a calming book. These are things that might help, and be things that you would observe in people that are naturally good at long-term coping. So anyway, 5 minutes, and then I will pull you back. Where did my little thing go? Hello, there we are. Oh, I see some chat comments. Everybody's amygdalas are very big. Good, and I'm really glad that people are looking forward to reading the book. And yeah, I agree. Sapolsky is a little weird and a great character, but such people make excellent storytellers. All right, where is my breakout room thing? All right, I think we are all back now. So who can help me stay alive and prevent type A guy here from having a heart attack?
We need a
Our group,
nutritious diet.
yeah, our group talked about like I think her name was Tasha. She likes to exercise or something that like gets her in a routine, and so I think that's a good way to cope with stress and also like stay healthy.
Absolutely.
All those endorphins.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think that like to help somebody with like type A, 'cause I don't know if I have it, but I definitely think at times I'm very aggravated. Like I'm that person in line that's like, seriously, like you're having a conversation right now, like I want to leave, you know? So I definitely feel like maybe like practicing patience, because I feel like with quarantine, I've noticed how impatient I can be. And so I've really been working on trying to calm myself down. So I just feel like with somebody who has type A, 'cause I don't know if I have it, but like somebody who is a type A, maybe like just trying to work on your patience and just calm yourself down in those situations.
Very good points. Like when I first moved to Colorado, the slow, sort of relaxed, calm pace, I found frustrating, and like I remember like wanting to like push people out of my way, and yeah, like I was way too aggressive and impatient. And one thing that I think really has helped me there is actually having children. You sort of have to become patient with young children. So that's one thing that I think, there's so many studies, correlating, being in a long-term stable relationship and possibly having children with, living a little longer. There's so many reasons why that correlation could exist. But I will say I certainly feel like I am more patient now after having children than I used to be. And I also wanted to touch on scheduling a little bit there. There are studies out there showing, and many case reports of incredibly successful people that stick to these, very nice schedules. Some people, one comes to mind, the ex-CEO of Disney. He would always, wake up and, the first hour he would spend basically just in a routine of thinking, considering, and contemplating his own thoughts. I have this bad habit of checking my email and reading the news, when I wake up, and then I'm being bombarded with other people's thoughts. But I always thought it was interesting that, he spends time to reflect on his own thoughts. A lot of people exercise in the morning. Makes a lot of sense, seeing how your testosterone is higher, amongst other things. And one last thing, I'm sure you guys have probably heard of B.F. Skinner. Skinner, his big thing was real schedules. Skinner. Somebody have a thought there on Skinner? But yeah, Skinner, he even wrote a book about basically his utopian society back in the 60s. And his utopian commune was really all centered around the concept of schedules. And, in his Skinner boxes, he demonstrated that, if you change basically the rules of getting reinforcement to the contingencies of reinforcement, you can drastically alter an animal's behaviors. I mean, if an animal is responding for food under one schedule versus another, their behavior greatly shifts, which led him to think and conclude that they're basically scheduled laws out there that have impacted our biology in ways that control our patterns of behavior. And we function at a much more efficient manner if we, sort of live by very strict schedules. He himself lived by this principle. and wrote according to a schedule. Every, X amount of time, is a little timer would go off and you would go and write for a little bit. I think he wrote a lot, and that some of it's not actually all that good. So there might be, a little magic equation here of, scheduling, but also giving yourself some flexibility. Like, for example, I write best when my mind is in a certain, state. So, there are, but regardless, having some form of schedule, maybe not an incredibly rigid one that involves a commune, but like having some semblance of a schedule, I think can be very beneficial. All right, I'm jumping back into the PowerPoint here. Hopefully we are a little out of the monotony of my lecture there. So, there are many different effects that chronic stress can have on the body. Your dendrites can atrophy. You can have long-term changes in synaptic plasticity. Somebody mentioned beta endorphin. I mean, your endorphin and endocannabinoid levels can change. You can have changes in your benzodiazepine or endogenous benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are like Xanax and diazepam, or Valium. You can have changes in your heart, hypertension, sluggish responses to and recovery from stress, and a pathogenic cholesterol profile. Which is also can be related to what you eat. Although there are many studies showing that now that a lot of your cholesterol, really comes from your liver. But there can be sexual changes as well. You can have testicular atrophy, decreased levels of hormones of the gonadal axes. This can lead to erectile dysfunction. Ovaries, you can have a decreased level of gonadal hormones and increased risk of anovulation and miscarriage. It's very common that, during periods of stress, one does not cycle regularly and oftentimes even stop having periods. You see this in a variety of settings in society. One would be, Olympic gymnasts, these young girls that are probably in incredible states of stress, might have issues with ovulation. You also see this in drug addiction. When one is using and abusing and binging on a drug, you could have very big drastic changes in normal cycling. The immune system is also affected. Basically your immune system is suppressed. You're more likely to get sick when you are stressed out. Your adrenal glands change. You would have elevated basal levels of glucocorticoids, which we're about to get into and talk about in great depth. You're going to have a sluggish response and recovery from the stress. And also, I want you to keep in mind that many of these things are working together. If you have changes in your immune system, you're going to have changes in your neural system. If you have changes in your neural system, you're going to have changes in your gonads. All of these things are going to basically intertwine at some level. And it's also important to note that there are many different types of stressors, and our bodies are not wired to differentiate them. So, a wild dog searching for his next meal might bring on the stress system. Seeing a lion in the wild might bring on the stress system. This is what these systems were selected for. However, a college student studying for their final exams produces the same stress response. And the same coping mechanisms will also be engaged by the same sort of responses to these stressors. So it isn't like your stress response is different for studying for the final versus seeing a lion or searching for your next meal in the wild when you don't have an incredibly huge pantry and grocery store that you can raid. There are very clear biological systems involved in mediating stress. The systems operate in a non-linear interactive network in which various mediators of down and up, mediators down and up regulate one another. And I mean, these are working together in harmony. The activity of these systems is closely coupled to your genetic makeup, your psychological makeup and history, your developmental history, and social status.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
This might be going back a little bit, but can you just like clarify the difference between downregulation and upregulation?
Yeah, absolutely. It really depends on the level at which you're talking about. In this context, um, you know, th- uh, basically, I'm talking at a more global level. So, for example, your adrenals, can be in a state where they're pumping out greater amounts of cortisol. So that increase in cortisol can sort of have a domino effect on other systems at a greater level. That is not to be confused with the more sort of cellular up and down regulation, which could also be involved here in creating long-term changes. There, I would be talking about down and up regulation of specific receptors in the plasma membrane. Prolonged activation of a receptor can lead to, basically its desensitization, which is loss of a G protein coupled receptor function, or downregulation, which is complete sequestration into the cell so that it's no longer present. Those forms of down and upregulation at the cellular level can sort of stamp in long-term neural changes that become more ingrained, potentially permanent. And that would be basically a long-term adaptation. But here, I'm primarily talking about just you would have an upregulation in, say, cortisol release, which could then have a effect or a domino effect on other systems, as opposed to sort of like the stamping in that would occur with an up or down regulation of receptors in the brain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Basically, like downregulation is something that is like either deactivated, turned off, avoided. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Exactly. Um, right. So let's talk about the stress response. The stressors basically disrupt your typical physiological homeostasis, which is a very, think of it as a balancing act. The stress response is a group of physiological and behavioral responses that help reestablish homeostasis. And again, I want to note that stress responses are non-specific. I mean, it doesn't matter if there is a final exam or a lion, the stress response is going to be the same. There are a couple major endocrine systems. Epinephrine or adrenaline is going to be released from the adrenal medulla. Adrenaline or epinephrine would be released first in response to a stressor. Norepinephrine and noradrenaline would also be released at that point in time. And we're going to touch on those a little bit, but we're especially going to touch on glucocorticoids, which are released from the other part of the adrenals, the adrenal cortex. And they're released a few minutes later. And these are particularly important because glucocorticoids, but not epinephrine and norepinephrine, pass the blood-brain barrier. And seeing how this is a class on, epinephrine is going to have many effects throughout the body, but seeing how this is hormones, brain, and behavior, essentially, or hormones and behavior comes from the brain, we are going to focus a little bit more on glucocorticoids. So first, a little bit about the history of the stress response. Walter Cannon is really the first name that you should be aware of. He developed the concept of emergency theory and really coined the name, this idea of a fight or flight response. And he demonstrated that the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine or adrenaline immediately following exposure to virtually any stressor. And this would be a means of adapting to that stress, very important for the fight or flight response. And just a small change in epinephrine is enough to cause major changes in respiratory and cardiac tone. He also, had some very unique, observations in battle and war. For example, following a gut shot, there are going to be changes that occur physiologically. One of which, and this is something that I still use in surgery sometimes myself when I do, surgery in my experiments, in certain areas of the brain, such as the top of the scalp. If you squirt a little epinephrine and norepinephrine, adrenaline and noradrenaline, it causes you to stop bleeding. So again, like that would be a very adaptive response. You get injured, you get shot, your epinephrine and norepinephrine systems kick in and have a lot of physiological effects, one of which might be to reduce bleeding in that region, even allowing you to run, to run and get somewhere safe. And then you would plop down, and your sympathetic nervous system response would stop being overreactive. And you get into that parasympathetic response where you might, well, in this case, be just looking to find a solution to the fact that you just got shot. But after an exam, maybe your epinephrine and norepinephrine die down a little bit, and your parasympathetic system really kicks in, and you want to eat a whole pizza or a huge bowl of pasta to sort of recover. So here's just a general picture depicting this idea that the immediate non-specific component of the stress response involves the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenals, which is involved in that initial fight or flight response. Here you can see some measurements that were taken from the blood of PhD students, leading up to the day and on the day of their PhD dissertation defense, which, as you can imagine, is an incredibly stressful thing for a PhD student. Mine was especially stressful. I had already moved on and had to fly back to do my dissertation defense. My future boss decided, was willing to pay for all of that to occur. So he could go ahead and start bringing me in to start working for him and producing, lots of data. But anyway, as you can see, epinephrine and norepinephrine shoot up in the blood on the day of that stressful event. Again, it's non-specific, might have evolved for the lion attack, but now is more responsive to things like exams. This is a diagram that I want you to be able to draw. I would like you to be able to draw this, to label it. I think you should get to the point that you are teaching the HPA axis out loud to your favorite stuffed animal or figure on the wall. Basically the entire hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and the adrenal is often omitted. Don't omit that. Because it's a key component there. People often think that HPA axis is just hypothalamic pituitary axis, but it's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Basically the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone. I and many other people commonly say corticotropin releasing factor. We now recognize this as a hormone and should call it corticotropin releasing hormone rather than factor. This acts on the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex, which then is going to release cortisol. cortisol is going to act on the really throughout the body to produce a wide array of effects. But there are receptors for cortisol in the anterior pituitary.
I'm on my phone doing it.
Was there a question? Okay.
Yeah, I had a quick question about like prolonged stress. So with people who have chronic illnesses, they're in an environment. Bodies are like, they have a hard time getting into the parasympathetic. Is that because their body is just constantly in that arousal state that it just cannot regulate itself? Is that what happens?
In part, yes. And then, so there's actually sort of long-term adaptation to that in sort of a third stage of the stress response. So if this initial phase is meant to bring us back to homeostasis, long-term, if you remain in that state, it's not so much that your hormones normalize, but you see basically changes in the postsynaptic response and the receptor responses to that heightened effect throughout the body. And this can lead to long-term detrimental effects. I've already brought up the idea of Cushing's disorder, which is particularly relevant here. Cushing's disorder basically is an inability to respond to that negative feedback of cortisol in the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. The brains of someone with Cushing's disease do not react to the cortisol being elevated. So they just continue dumping out cortisol. And as a result, Cushing's patients tend to, have metabolic issues. They gain a lot of weight. And they also have psychological issues. They almost always tend to develop depression. And this is due to many different sort of domino type effects of receptor adaptation of being sort of constantly hammered by this sort of fight or flight response. And I'll get into some of that in a little greater detail, if not today, in our next lecture. So here you can see the big picture of both the neural response and the glucocorticoid response. And by that, I'm talking really about, the primary example, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. But when the hypothalamus is activated by a stressor, that's going to activate the sympathetic nervous system first. And this isn't one or the other. It's just that the sympathetic nervous system kicks in first. And that's going to activate the adrenals to release norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are going to be released into the bloodstream and activate many responses throughout the body. This is going to involve the activation of glands, smooth muscles, a variety of things, but the norepinephrine and epinephrine do not pass through the blood-brain barrier. In addition, you are going to have CRF. See here, it's called CRF. It's actually but think of it as CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone rather than factor, being released by the hypothalamus, which is going to act on the pituitary, the anterior pituitary through the blood to lead to the secretion of ACTH, which is going to act on the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Cortisol can enter the brain, and it's going to have effects on the brain in addition throughout the body. That latter response, the glucocorticoid response, the release of cortisol, is going to be a little slower, but it is happening in concert rather than one or the other. Again, I'm really just trying to hammer this home because I would like you to know this pathway and be able to basically describe it to me. But the hypothalamus would release corticotropin releasing hormone in response to a stressor. And this would be after, really in addition to epinephrine and norepinephrine being released. But, when the ACTH is elevated, in addition to epinephrine and norepinephrine being released, you're going to see this sort of slower release of glucocorticoids like cortisol that can then act back on the brain. And if cortisol is up for a heightened period of time, it's going to have profound psychological effects. Depression is one that can kick in. Addiction is another. Many people that have had issues with addiction relapse when their cortisol is elevated. Normally, you would see a return to baseline through sort of a return to homeostasis. Here you can see the effects of military recruits preparing for their first parachute jump and then subsequent parajumps after that. You can see that norepinephrine, cortisol, epinephrine, and growth hormone are all elevated on the first day that they jump out of an airplane. But after they've done this 5 times or 11 times, their body has basically adapted to it, and this is no longer a huge stressor to them. By contrast, testosterone is the opposite. The first day testosterone goes down, and then it normalizes. So this would be a normal response. There are people that cannot come back to this sort of negative coping or this homeostatic response, and they probably shouldn't be jumping out of airplanes. So again, why such a focus on glucocorticoids? I've already alluded to this, but epinephrine doesn't pass the blood-brain barrier, whereas cortisol would. Endocrine mediators of the stress response must affect the brain in order to influence behavior, which is why we are going to really focus on glucocorticoids here, which are great candidates for mediating behavioral effects of distress because steroid hormones released in response to numerous stressors. Steroid hormones can easily diffuse past the blood-brain barrier, and glucocorticoid receptors are located in several brain regions. Hans Selye was an important figure here. He really built on some of the previous work that we've talked about, and he sort of serendipitously discovered some of the brain's and body stress responses, and really the 3-step stress response, including chronic stress response that we're going to get into here in a minute. So he was trying to understand the effect of ovarian hormones by injecting them into rats. And it turns out he was not very good at handling rats. He was stressing out all of his rats. And both animals in the saline group and those that were getting the ovarian hormone were developing peptic ulcers, altered thymus levels, spleen hypertrophy, etc. So he ultimately concluded that he was the factor here. He was the independent variable rather than the ovarian extracts, and it was the fact that he just sucked at handling the rats. So he designed another experiment to especially investigate the effect of stress, and kept the rats in cold conditions for 2 days, 2 weeks, or 2 months, which is very stressful, and found that basically you saw different responses at different levels. I will come back to this, and this is where I'll start on our next lecture after we get into the Sapolsky book. Just in case I don't remember, I did want to point out one interesting little side note about Selye. In addition to first really characterizing this sort of immediate and then long-term stress effect, which, like we're going to get into in our next lecture, one controversial side of Selye is, without reporting it, he took an awful lot of money from the tobacco industry back in the day and was part of their sort of tobacco is good campaign. He was a smoker himself, and without acknowledging this in his work, he was taking, basically a good bit of money from the tobacco industry for consultation and comments. He defended the tobacco industry in congressional hearings, even arguing that increased regulation of the tobacco industry would lead to increased stress in our society. Cigarettes and nicotine are very important for us to deal with stress. And if we were to have increased regulation against cigarettes, that would have long-term deleterious effects on the health of our society because of its influence and stress. Of course, I would argue that cigarette smoking, and I think most people would now, is a negative coping strategy, much like turning to alcohol, or abuse of sedative hypnotics or opioids. All of these things are, negative coping strategies that really are going to make the long-term response to chronic stress much worse. But I'll get back to Saley's experiment and start here basically next time. Any questions? I'll stop the recording now.